Okay, so we are on week 6 now. The Range of Strength teacher training. We're halfway through. And this week we are talking about what's probably become my favorite topic. More recently, with some of the learnings and wins that I've had with developing better systems around it. This week we're talking about addressing the side bend. And I was going to call it addressing lateral strength, but I think even more so within that and within the scope of this teacher training, we want to put emphasis on side bending and particularly sequencing exercises in such a way that it allows us to help individuals find more movement freedom through the ability to bend laterally to the side. We've had big wins, I think, in recent years with the understanding of the mobility of the spine needing to flex to Jefferson curl. So bending through flexion, bending forward. I think we're starting to ignite the fire around the importance of bending backwards. Not so much with the back bend itself as a back bridge, but even just with the range of strength sit up, thinking about that global extension of the trunk and having the ability to stretch and lengthen through strength behind the body as well. So within that, we also need to get better at addressing the bending from the side. I feel that I've been fortunate to have a powerlifting background where in my early years, side bending was important in that discipline. So it was ingrained in me early, the importance of side bending. We would finish heavy squat sessions and deadlift sessions with set after set of heavy dumbbell side bends to just work on strengthening our trunk for overall more strength to the traditional lifts. Since becoming a more focused flexibility coach, I've brought that with me and also have been seeking out better ways to help people free up the trunk. And in doing so, learn to get the pelvis rotating and moving more freely as it relates to unlocking new feats of range. This is something that you're probably aware of if you've already been coaching and working with individuals that are working on feats of range and working on being in these positions where the pelvis is very compromised and hard to articulate in extension or rotate in positions that we want it to. The trunk is very related to that. So in this lesson, we really want to focus on how we can better address this and how we can find better ways of sequencing it so that it leads ultimately to the ability to unlock more movement freedom and more abilities towards these feats of range that we're focusing on. So we are particularly going to talk about 4 muscle groups that we want to be targeting and focusing on with the sequencing of movements and movements that we choose. And these 4 movements will have the biggest impact in that goal of freeing up the trunk and the pelvis and learning to move around there more freely. Particularly when we think about these muscle groups, we want to think about how we can apply strength and range. You'll notice that some of them, maybe you have been exposed to some of the presentations already on some of the movements we've been using and implementing more, but some of these muscle groups don't really get addressed in that way. They get addressed in one way or the other, just as a strength component or as a range component, or just the flexibility is being worked. So we're trying to work on integrating better systems to combine both, because you can't just stretch the area. That's the common theme with us as range of strength coaches. We're always looking to provide that strength stimulus even more so. So the first muscle group we're going to talk about is the quadratus lumborum. And this is the QL. So we hear this a lot. We're addressing the QL. QL lifts, QL exercises, QL walks. The QL is a very important part of that freedom of movement around the pelvis. Its action is to provide stabilization and movement of the spine and the pelvis. The bilateral contraction of the QL leads us to greater extension of the lumbar region. So we know that we want to produce nice lumbar extension in movements like seated good morning pancake, Romanian deadlift, these hinge patterns that provide extension. And extension is the one that the industry itself really focuses on for safe back. But it's actually quite difficult for people to articulate that extension and articulate the QL to provide that stimulus. But last week's assignment, we focused on those post-chain extension and flexion movements. If there were limits there in extension, the QL would be an area that we would want to address, like the weakness of the QLs. It also serves the function to laterally flex the trunk from side to side. So the QL allows us, the better that we can strengthen it through lateral flexion, the more freedom of movement it will give us in those planes of motion. And we want strength and range in that plane, even though it's been engineered in our minds with more recent application that, bending the trunk to the side is unsafe for the back, and that it's just a column that stabilizes the spine. But we're learning more that it's not a column, it's a spinal engine, and the spine moves us. So the muscles around the spine need to have range and strength that move us well as also. So the QL is a big one. So when we're thinking about these side bending movements, we want to be thinking about exercises that lead us to greater range and strength in the quadratus lumborum. We're also going to be really putting an emphasis on the obliques, and more specifically, the external obliques. So the external obliques extend from the lower half of the ribs right down into the pelvis. So again, it's another muscle that functions in that attachment and awareness and movement of the pelvis region. The obliques help us rotate the trunk, but what most people also forget that the obliques help us do is they help us pull the chest as a whole in a downward movement. And they also provide us with compression ability in those deep range positions where we're looking for end range strength. The oblique functions in that way. So if we're thinking about pikes and pancakes, Jefferson curls, and all these things, we need to have super strong functioning obliques that move through their greatest range of motion in strength in order to produce these movements. Sorry, next muscle group here. The tensor fascia lata, so the TFL. Now this is the one that I have been getting more into this year and trying to find ways to look for what's missing and try to find those solutions. The TFL is one that is not really addressed in terms of strength. Syndromes that come up with the TFL, like TFL syndrome, is a very common one. Most of these protocols, like in a clinical setting, don't provide strength to the TFL, but rather just basic stretching exercises to stretch the area where that's uncomfortable. We can do a better job at this, and we can provide better strength stimulus for the TFL. And again, it's another muscle group that originates around the pelvis, and it has an insertion point by the greater trochanter, and its primary movement is hip abduction. So if we're thinking about, the greater trochanter and how the ball of the femur bone attaches into the hip socket, the muscles that have insertion points around that area, when they're weak, tight, and limited, are going to prevent the hip socket from functioning properly. So the TFL, we can find better ways to strengthen the TFL and do that so through length to provide that freedom through the hip socket that we're looking for. And the last one's the piriformis, closely related to the TFL, and it also does have that insertion point by the greater trochanter, and it's more so of a hip external rotator in itself. Within the course, we've already worked on stretching the piriformis, and We spent a lot of time working on the right way to stretch the piriformis and the positioning and regressing it for the right individual. But we can do a better job at strengthening it through length as well. And if we can do that, we can provide that movement freedom we're looking for through the trunk in lateral flexion, in rotation, and through the pelvis as well. So we know our target muscle groups, and we now want to think about exercises that hit these muscle groups. The exercises that work these muscle groups have to lead us somewhere. Often the time is, as we've discussed or we're learning with the range of strength system, we're always trying to lead to somewhere. And oftentimes people that are working on these deficits and limitations aren't really being led somewhere. It's just this prehabilitative approach to just kind of work the area, but not really lead to something that's going to produce that freedom of movement. So our sequencing is the key for us to think about how we're going to lead someone to better movement. We use the feats of range, the big six, but it could be a lot of different types of feats of range. So we want to look at better ways of sequencing the side bending to lead to this. I've had a great connection with a coach this year, James Fuller. Strongman Archaeology is his tag on Instagram. And we did do that bonus lesson with him. And I loved how, if you go and watch that lesson, or if you've seen it, or you've met James, I love how he uses the cross leg side bend exercise as an entry point for strength. So he doesn't prescribe his clients traditional leg dominant exercises and even some upper body dominant exercises until they get proficient at cross leg side bend. And his reasoning for that is that the piriformis TFL and QLs are so jammed up and limited and weak in most individuals that if we don't address that first to teach them how to properly free up the trunk and the pelvis to get it rotating and moving freely, then they just won't be set up for success moving into more traditional, which is traditional movements are more advanced nowadays for people. They won't be set up for that. And he also works on self-loaded barbell movements, like old school, old-time strongman exercises that do require you to actually side bend to load the bar. So that would be another reason why. But along with that, the research that I've done with Real Movement members in the last year has allowed me to actively seek out these better ways for us to move from point A to point B. So like for me, starting out as a flexibility coach, I kind of had point A and I had maybe an ending point, but I didn't have these points in between. The sequencing wasn't there, where I was able to kind of have a way of moving someone in a more progressive manner from one to the next. So through this year's research with the Real Movement members and implementing a lot of range of strength philosophies, and then bringing guys like James Fuller in, we've been finding better ways to do this for side bending itself, like the lateral strength components. So this is the key this week, is that your biggest take home will be how you sequence your movements when you address side bending to lead someone to a greater ability in this movement. So for this week's assignment, we're going to look at, and it's not really a challenge. I just want you to try the protocol once and share your learning. So it's a side bend sequence protocol that I put together. One new exercise in there, just based on some of the research I've been doing on my own with exercises I've implemented with you guys and gotten feedback from, and ideas being shared around like what might be the best way to move the hamstring into the picture with the side bending movements. So I want you to review this sequence. I want you to do it. And what you're going to do is share a screenshot of your before and after and some insights on your experience. So before you do the sequence, you're going to take a screenshot of your seated straddle side bend. So in straddle, you're going to side bend to both sides, reach overhead. And at the end of the sequence, I want you to showcase the seated straddle. This aligns with that concept of a movement freedom check-in. And what I'm hoping to find with this sequence is that because it's laid out in a progressive manner from easiest to hardest, that you will be able to channel in on some new range. And if anything, you'll be able to share the insight of how you felt starting at an easier point and then working upwards through the harder positions. Also, if you haven't had a chance, watch the bonus lesson in Ranger Strength certification, lateral strength. So that was the support call we did with James. He shared a lot of gold material there that I think will help you a lot and get your mind thinking a little bit more about the impact we can have on people if we address this better, and go through the quiz and just kind of get your brain a little more around this topic this week, along with the sequence that we're going to do. And that is it for this week.